Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming to listen. Thanks for the invitation up here. I've had a great time already today talking with everybody about UVM and science and the GUND, and look forward to a lot more tonight and tomorrow. So let's see. Let's just turn that off for a second. So in my work, I aim to not only address fundamental research questions and write papers out of them, but also to help solve practical, real-world problems in conservation and natural resources. And those problems typically, I would argue, almost always involve ecological systems and social systems and their interactions. And so does my research. I focus on the intersection between ecology and economics, but also lots of other disciplines from hydrology to sociology to poverty studies and so forth, whatever is necessary to attack the sort of problem that's at hand. So one of the concepts, I think, that of course is fundamental to the work of a place like World Wildlife Fund, which is interested in adjusting social ecological systems for better outcomes for biodiversity. It's also, of course, very central to what the GUND Institute's been about as well. So I think one concept that really unites social and ecological systems is this of ecosystem services, which I doubt I have to explain to anybody, but just to make sure you know where I'm coming from, I would describe them as the benefits that nature provides to people, the various things that ecosystems do that support or enhance our lives. So bees pollinate crops, wetlands purify water and slow down floods. We get medicines and foods and fiber and recreational opportunities all out of nature. And so three things I think are relevant and are important about this concept as an illustration that I'm going to focus on for this talk. First of all, they explicitly connect ecological and social systems. They force us to think about the interactions between what nature's doing and how ecosystems work, and the benefits we get and how those feed into our ecological and social systems. So it's a way of forcing this interaction that I think is really healthy and useful and interesting from a research point of view. Secondly, I think they benefit from being a really powerfully intuitive idea. So people just get intuitively that nature does things that support our lives, and we don't account for that very well. And when we do, we realize how important they are and tend to behave or decide differently. And that's an idea that resonates with people in the World Bank and people in government agencies and my own family, who otherwise doesn't get a lot of what I do. So I think that's useful for us as we're trying to be relevant in our research to decision makers and so forth. And lastly, it's just fun as a researcher. It's a really rich area of research that has a lot of really thorny problems that needs to borrow from the best of all these disciplines to get at. So for all these reasons, I think it's an interesting and important and fun place to be working. So for a lot of people, the idea of ecosystem services was crystallized in this Millennium Ecosystem Services Assessment, of which this is one of the covers of the results. Lots of people, of course, were working on ecosystem services long before this assessment came along, many of them here at Vermont and elsewhere. But this was this 5-year effort among about 1,000 scientists funded and sponsored by the UN to assess the state of the world's ecosystems, their contributions to our well-being, and how they're changing, and therefore those contributions are changing. And that, I think, galvanized a lot of research around this. And you can see its imprint, actually, in the productivity of research community around papers that cite ecosystem services as a keyword. So the Millennium Assessment ended right here. You can see it was part of growth already, but it's been a sort of exponential rise since in the number of papers published over time with the keywords around ecosystem services. So the scientific community is really getting around this idea. What I think is equally interesting, though, is it's getting out into the more popular consciousness as well. And this is a cover of The Economist from a bunch of years ago now, but there have been 2 since, talking about this idea that nature has value to our lives. I'm not sure it's going to rescue environmentalism entirely, but at least it's relevant to the way in which we study and manage natural systems. Okay, so there are lots of ways to think about the variety of research that goes on within ecosystem services. I've chosen to just really simply array them on 2 axes as a framework for this talk. So studies vary in the number of services they take on at a time and in the scale and generality at which they treat ecosystem services. I would say that the Millennium Assessment, that thing I just told you about, anchors the upper right of this graph. It was this global assessment of all the world's ecosystem services, trying to get a very top-line view of nature's contribution to human well-being. More recently, TEEB, or the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity project, is another one that's up there involving a lot of people, a lot of services at global scales. And what my talk's going to do is kind of trace through my own research program kind of a series of projects that move elsewhere in this space. One, a really detailed field experiment on a single service in a single place, trying to do a very detailed job on the ecology and the economics of the value of one service to, in this case, local farmers. Another step, trying to get a little bolder and posit a general model of how this one ecosystem service might work in agricultural landscapes broadly, and to test that a lot of places. And then third, to move off to the right and tackle several ecosystem services at once at broader scales, so watershed scales, state, sub-country scales, trying to assess the contributions of multiple interacting services to human welfare at these broader scales, which I think are the scales at which big policy and conservation decisions are made. Watershed authorities, state governments, regional nonprofits, that kind of thing. So that's kind of an outline of the talk and how, in my mind, it all fits together. The one service I'm talking about for the first two projects is crop pollination. So this is my favorite ecosystem service to study. Turns out that about 2/3 of all crops, commercially grown crops in the world, require insect pollination or animal pollination to set full marketable fruit. So some are entirely dependent, some only slightly so, but when you count it all up, about 2/3 of crops depend on animal pollinators to produce fully. And it's, all the fun things in life, frankly. So, apples and blueberries and watermelons and tomatoes, coffee, so keeping us all awake now. This is my favorite. It's a twofer, chocolate-covered almonds, both cacao and almonds, obligate outcrossed plants. So thank pollinators for that lovely combination. And even although this is a little bit dicey, but still just too fun to put up, the agave that leads to tequila is a bat-pollinated plant. So thank a pollinator whenever you're enjoying any of these things. It's this important thing to at least the variety of our diet and a lot of the micronutrient content of nutrition. It's not a huge fraction of global production because, rice and corn and potatoes, the big staples are wind-pollinated, well, not potatoes, the big staples are wind-pollinated grasses. So it's a small fraction of production, but animal pollinated plants tend to be about 5 times more valuable per kilogram than the staples. And so as an economic concern, they become a little more valuable than that 8% might have you believe. So one thing, when you think about pollination, you often think about managed pollinators, honeybees, and hives. And there's been a lot of talk about colony collapse disorder and so forth. But the broader picture is a pretty compelling one. So this is just a graph from a paper by Eisen and Harder, tracing the number of hives and how it's grown as a percentage over a 1961 baseline, and the number of agricultural production, the change in ag production requiring pollinators. And you can see that bees have gotten 40% more numerous, and the crops that require them have gotten 250% larger. And so there's a demand outpacing supply problem with this managed solution to our pollination services, taking around boxes of honeybees and moving them into crops. We're just growing more pollination-dependent crops than we are growing bees to do it. Also, the ones we are growing are susceptible increasingly to all these diseases, tracheal mites, colony collapse disorder, a variety of fungal pathogens. And so there's a real interest in whether native bees, wild pollinators, can do the job. Is there a role for these native pollinators to perform this ecosystem service of crop pollination, especially as we demand more and more of fewer and fewer honeybees? So this is just a few of many, many examples about wild bees on a variety of crops. Some of them do just as well on an efficiency basis. Some of them do much better than honeybees on an efficiency basis. And the big question is, have we conserved enough bee habitat within our agricultural landscapes to support these providers of this service? Is that enough? I'd say probably not. But the question's still open, how much is? So that's motivated a lot of my work, is how do we manage agricultural landscapes to provide not only food, but also enough bee habitat, frankly, and simply put, to continue this pollination service provision. So that's really the central question of this Project 1, this field experiment, right? What's the value of tropical forests as sources of pollinators to surrounding crops? So an air photo of a landscape you'll see again, and just to be clear, I've tinted the forest green as my source of pollinators to surrounding coffee. And the question is there some zone near forest where coffee growers are getting this benefit, a subsidy of wild pollination, and those too far away are not? That's the main question I'm asking. So I asked this question in a field in a farm in Costa Rica, where I could find a big homogeneous area of coffee. This is a large coffee farm in yellow, and 2 forest patches of significant size. And I just did a distance transect from each, near, medium, far, coming into the center of this, with the far sites being 1.5 kilometers away from the nearest forest, which is farther than even honeybees typically fly. Right? So that's the design, trying to get a nice isolation gradient from a source of bees and ask what happens in coffee fields as increased isolation happens from sources of bees. So we went out to all those sites. Sorry, the blue dots in there are the field sites. And at those sites, we just watched coffee while it flowered and watched bees visiting and got a sense for who was coming and how often. And we found that, again, here's this near, medium, far design. And now I'm showing the number of visits to flowers in a standardized way. This is visitation rate, how many bees are coming, how often. You can see twice the visitation rate in sites that are near forest and farther away, right? So coffee farmers near forest are getting a lot more attention from bees, wild bees, than those that are further away. And pollen deposition follows the same thing. So you actually pluck the stigma out of a flower, squish it under a microscope, and count pollen grains, which takes forever. But the idea is, that visitation is ramifying into a doubling of pollen deposition rate. So pollen's moving around more in those near sites. So then we asked, okay, well, is coffee responding? Does coffee care about this at all? And to do this, there's just a classic pollen limitation experiment where you leave some branches open to measure production under ambient pollination, the bees that are there. And then you take matched branches and you hand pollinate them to give them all the pollen they could ever want and see if production is different among those branches. So we did that at those same 12 sites. And this is what we found, which takes a little explanation. But here's, again, near, medium, far. And this is pollination deficit. So it's essentially the production under no treatment, what ambient bees are doing, minus the production under hand pollination. And if that dips below 0, that means when I added pollen, it produced more, which means it wasn't getting sufficient pollination already. If it didn't move or stayed above 0, it means pollination was sufficient. So what this is telling you is sort of sufficient, significantly insufficient. So when I pollinated coffee, it did better, which means farther sites were suffering for a lack of pollination services. And this is all in these relative units, but when you do the math, it turned out to be a 20% decrease in production of coffee beyond about 1 kilometer from forest, right? That's the bottom line here. So that's the sort of ecology of it. Now let's try to do the economic valuation. What does this mean in terms of coffee production value? So what we need for numbers, so here's a kind of depiction of that. Here's this same map of mine, the coffee farm and the 2 green forest patches. And now in orange, I've denoted the zone very simply in GIS that's beyond 1 kilometer from forest. This is the zone where it's producing less, and here are these 1 kilometer buffers that are enjoying this service. So we need that number. The forest effect is about 1 kilometer. The yield beyond 1 kilometer, so fanegas, I've kind of scrubbed this talk of all these funky Costa Rican units, except for one because I like it. A fanega is 200 liters of fresh picked coffee berries. Now you all know. So, you could transmit it to liters if you wanted or kilograms, but essentially these two numbers differ by 20%, and on average they add up to the productivity that farm reported. And then net revenue for a fanega of picked coffee is $35 after fixed costs and variable costs. Okay? So with all those numbers, we can say, what would be the marginal change in revenue to this field, this coffee farm, if those 2 forests that I was pinning my gradients on were cut? So a marginal change in the ecosystem, what would be the marginal value of that change? So the map would become like this: much more orange area that's more than 1 kilometer from the nearest forest, 480 more hectares of that, and the math is pretty simple to know that that's worth $62,000 in income to that one farm. Okay? So there's a lot of ways you want to put values like this in context. I'll just offer a few of them. One is a policy context. So Costa Rica has this wonderful progressive policy, a government payment for ecosystem services. They actually call it that. They pay for those 4 services. And if you're a landowner that agrees to keep their forest or regrow it, you can earn $70 per hectare per year from a government payment. So that's sort of an implicit value the government's placed on the ecosystem service of a hectare of forest. Just by dividing the size by the value I got, it's roughly 5 times that just for pollination services on a per hectare basis. So the policy is a great one, but it's undervaluing ecosystem services pretty clearly. The other context is opportunity costs, all right? What else could you do with the land? And it turns out that this per hectare value falls in kind of the middle of the range of expected rents to agriculture for the range of things that go on there. So cattle grazing, coffee production, sugarcane. It's kind of in the middle. Sugarcane on good years will beat it. Cattle rarely does. So that's a nice case study in Costa Rica. And before I go to the next study, I just want to say that we've been working. Now there's about 25 studies that have done roughly this same design on crops all over the world with different bee faunas, different crops themselves, different agricultural practices, biomes and climates and things. And the authors of all those studies have been getting together for the last 3 or 4 years with an NCEAS grant to try to synthesize whether we can learn something general about how essentially the landscape ecology of crop pollination services. There's something general across all this variance. And I'm not going to talk much about it, except to say that we took this hierarchical Bayesian modeling approach where, just look at this for a second, sorry for the dizzying graph, but these are my same data on visitation, now just with this exponential decline fitted to it, right? Which is just governed by a decline parameter people usually call beta. And just imagine that, same data you saw before, and now all 25, same kind of thing. And you can see some fit really well, some don't, some actually go up, which is odd. And the idea was, can we distill sort of a consensus decline rate, if there is one, among all these studies? So what these hierarchical Bayesian models do is give you this uncertainty distribution around this decay rate that would explain all studies best, essentially, just to cut to the intuition about these hierarchical models. So this is a distribution of the decay rate that all of these studies suggest if you take them together in this hierarchical way. And it's significantly negative, and that's its value. The more intuitive way to look at it is, what would the graph be if we just smeared them all together? And it would look like this. So this is the consensus decline in visitation rate of native pollinators to agriculture as you get further and further from sources of bees. And across all these 25 studies and continents and crops and everything, it's a really sharp decline that at about 700 meters from the nearest source of bees falls in half, right? So you get half the visitation rate to pollinated crops after you get about 3/4 of a kilometer away, which is not a bad fit to my own study, and now is this sort of consensus idea from a lot of them. So I just touched on that paper really briefly to say that we're trying to figure out how general these things are that we're learning in an individual place. And we're finding that some things are actually quite general. So it's kind of emboldened us to think about this second thing I wanted to tell you about, and that's a general model of how pollination services are delivered on agricultural landscapes. Okay, so that was the first one. Now onto this general model, as I said. So why do this? Yeah, so one is to test whether we have this general understanding or not. Is the stuff we're learning with coffee in Costa Rica and watermelon in California generalizable? And a way to do that is to force yourself to sort of write it down as a model and then test it against new situations. Another thing we want to do is extrapolate from field observations. So be able to make sort of predictive maps of pollinator service delivery beyond where we've actually gone to the field and studied, because that's expensive. It'd be nice to predict pollination services in unstudied landscapes for that same reason. There are lots of decisions going on in studies where I haven't been a postdoc for 3 years to study it. And so we need to be able to make cautious but rigorous predictions about a lot of these services in new places. And I think once you have this model, you can play with scenarios of land use change, kind of like I did in that experimental case, to ask about changes in policies and climates and market forces to see what the consequences of an ecosystem service would be. So again, these are all general reasons I'm going to attack it through pollination itself. So I made the decision not to show you, the math of the model, which I hope was the right one. Those of you who are interested in seeing equations can talk to me later. But I instead tried to just distill it into kind of an intuitive version of what this model's doing. So back to this this thing you've seen before, the air photo, the forest is still forest. Now we have this coffee field we're going to consider in yellow. And what the model essentially does is 5 steps. First, it takes data on source abundance, which you can get from surveys, so where the bees are, where their nests are, where their forage is, where you'd expect abundance to vary and how you'd expect to vary around the landscape. So we've used everything from expert opinion to survey data to parameterize this part of the model. And then we model how pollinators will fly out from where they're nesting to crops and accumulate there as visitors. And so we use this handy meta-analysis that we did, the Bayesian stuff, to estimate the decay rate of expected visitation away from a nest site. We have a simple model about how that affects crop yields, so what the crop would yield with no pollinators and how it's asymptotically increasing after you add pollinators. And then we take that value and you distribute it back out to its source, again, using this same exponential decline. So what we're interested in is the value of those forests. So we let bees affect crops and then distribute that value back to where the bees came from. All in a very simple production function that the goal is to be able to be useful with few data. And it may sound complicated, but it's a lot simpler than the models we've distilled down from to produce this. So that's kind of the intuition of how this works. And it's all written clearly and mathematically in these, and I can tell anybody who's interested about that. So testing it in Costa Rica is the thing I'm going to talk about now. Here's this landscape again. Here's this oddly shaped single coffee farm, just for reference, and I'm going to keep it outlined in dots for you. So we have a land cover map, 1 meter air photo that we've classified into a simple land use map. Source abundances, we have a lot of survey data from various parts of Costa Rica, but deliberately didn't use it because we wanted to have this be an independent test of the model. I'll show you that in a minute. So we took 3 bee biologists that were familiar with this part of the world and asked them sort of where they'd posit abundances of bees to be. Flight distances, again, I have lots of data on that, but I didn't want to use it because I want to use my data to test this model. But there's a really nice relationship that a bunch of us have found between just the body size of a bee, that's shoulder width essentially, and what its expected flight distance is. So all I had to know was what my bees were, and then I used this kind of allometric equation to give the model flight distances. And then crop yield effects are from my data, knowing what coffee, given my 20% finding, constructing a really simple yield curve that relates number of bees arriving at a field with its production in that nice unit, fanegas, and then market prices. So those are the data that went into this test in Costa Rica. And here's what the model comes out with. So here's this step, right? When we're letting bees fly from where they nest to where they might pollinate. And green is just forest for reference. Here's this dotted farm. And the shades of brown are predicted pollinator abundances. This is where we're predicting more pollinators to be. And you can see where it's shadowing the edges of the forest because they tend to be in the forest and then fly only a certain distance. So these are the sort of predicted distribution of this bee abundances. And here's the last step where we've actually calculated value and attributed it back to where it came from. So here's a map essentially in dollars per hectare of the expected benefits from that pixel to crop pollination in the landscape as configured now. So you can see the edges of forest patches that are closest to this coffee farm are very dark, but deeper in are not so dark because they're further away. And also coffee is a source of pollinators to itself because to a certain degree, pollinators do live there and they don't have to fly far to have that benefit confer. Okay, so this is essentially a map of where the value is sitting, calculated in dollars. So the question is, does this match my findings? So we've been doing some validation really recently about this. Predicted on-farm abundance from that model, again, parameterized, blind to my field data, and then comparing it to my field data. And it's a pretty good fit on predicting where abundance of bees would be. That's this result. And also we can ask, okay, what's the predicted yield from the model, and what's the observed pollinator deficit that I showed you in that other graph? And again, as far as ecological systems go, I'm pretty pleased with how predictive it is. So we're doing some validation to see whether this model's doing what we think it should do. And of course, the next step is, and we have an NSF grant to do this now, is to extend this validation to those 25 places that I showed you a map of before. So that's what's happening now, a whole lot of this kind of stuff. And I couldn't squeeze a result out of our postdoc in time to put in this talk. So I'll have to go without that. Okay, so now that we have this model and maybe we believe it, you can tell me whether you do, we can do some fun stuff, right? So I'll just tell you two of the things we're doing once we have a model like this. One is we can ask scenarios like questions, like what are the likely economic consequences of a land use change you can envision? And also ask more broadly, what are the marginal values on the landscape? Where would deforestation result in the largest losses, the largest incremental loss in an ecosystem service? So I'll just show you quickly those two examples. So one is this scenarios thing. So here's this model running again, and I've done the same thing as before, just turned off those two patches that are in yellow. I'm not sure if you can tell the difference between green and yellow, but this and this are two patches that I've run the model with them in and then out again, and asked, okay, who's hurt by that? So the shade of red corresponds to how much the income of that pixel of coffee went down, whoever owned it, right? So deep red around it and then shading around because they weren't getting much benefit from it anyway. Again, in terms of losses in dollars per hectare. And you can tote up the landscape and ask, so how much less productive does the landscape get for the loss of those two patches, just in terms of these pollination services, right? There's lots of other trade-offs and opportunity costs and things to come into play, but just asking this question. The other thing you can do is a more general question is ask this marginal value thing, right? Where would forest destruction cost the most in terms of coffee production? And for this, we essentially, I think I animated this, so we just took a kind of 10-hectare block, and if there were forest in that, we deforested it to pasture, like the least bee-friendly thing in the landscape. And then we re-ran the whole model and asked, okay, how much decrease in coffee production happened? Then we regrew all that forest and then turned off the next one. Just systematically asking where would this marginal value be highest? And the map you're seeing is the result map. So the darkest green is where the marginal values for coffee pollination are highest, where production for the landscape would decrease most if it were destroyed. Is that clear? You guys got what I was, okay. So what comes out in my mind is high marginal value scales with three things. It's got to be good bee habitat, it's got to be close to lots of coffee, and crucially, it's got to have few substitutes, right? So if that 10-hectare piece goes away, there isn't a neighboring one to provide the same service. And that's why these peninsulas are really dark, but the leading edges of these big patches are less so, is that if a piece of it goes, there's a source nearby. So obviously this result changes with every step, right? If you destroy a block and leave it destroyed, then the whole marginal value map changes. So this is just asking the consequences of the next marginal change, and you got to redo it each step. And also it clearly scales with how big a change you make it. We just arbitrarily chose 10 hectares because that tends to be the size of marginal land use change there, but if it were bigger chunks at a time, the map would look different. Okay. So there are lots of things we'd like to do with this. Some of them are just straight up limitations. Some of that are kind of hopeful things to do next. I think I'd like to build in some more realistic ecology about minimum patch sizes and things. I think all of these maps have been lacking really nicely displayed and clear uncertainty. Those are in the models, but we just haven't sort of carried them through and displayed them effectively. It's hard to do. Clearly, this is just about pollination services. There are lots of other trade-offs, other services to consider, but also the production values and expected rents. If you destroy forest, there are other benefits accruing to you in whatever you seem to be growing there. And also, there's a lot of responses that farmers can make to deforestation that would change these maps. They can switch crops or substitute pollination with managed pollinators and so forth. So some of these things are things to sort of consider and not forget about when you're thinking about a service at a time. Some of these are things we'd actually like to do to improve the model itself. Okay, so clearly there's more to life than pollination, much as I love it, much as I love my coffee and my almonds and my chocolate. But decisions are made based on more than one service at a time, especially more than pollination. So that kind of gets me to this third project, which is, I guess I'll put under the heading of the Natural Capital Project, and I'll explain why in a minute. But it's really an effort to scale up to scales at which big decisions are made, resource decisions at watershed scales or state scales, and to consider multiple ecosystem services because decisions have to take into account these trade-offs and the interactions among multiple benefit streams. So we're moving up and to the right in this graph. So I work at an NGO, right? And that means for a living, I talk to field programs of NGOs and government agencies in countries around the world, and I listen to what sorts of information they say they want and need to make good decisions. And when they talk about ecosystem services, which I said is a really intuitive idea and everyone kind of gets it, to be an operational component of the decisions they're making, these are the sorts of things they say they want to know. So what places provide the most ecosystem services? Where's the value on the landscape? Where would conservation pay off for my constituents? What are the trade-offs among different ecosystem services and with competing land uses? So, if I focus on carbon markets and REDD programs, what are my risks in terms of water shed services? That's actually a really, really big one. And how does it all compare to if I just, developed agriculture? How would a specific proposal, I said logging project here, it could be a road, affect different ecosystem services and biodiversity? That's a scenarios idea. Tell me the consequences of a decision I'm facing. And how are the benefits and costs of supplying these services distributed? That's an equity and poverty issue. So, would a payment for ecosystem services project tend to benefit the poorest of my constituents, or would they just go to the already rich, that kind of thing? So obviously there are more questions, but I've tried to distill them into the ones that I think are most commonly heard by people in my position. So in large part, motivated by this kind of thing, a bunch of us have started this thing called the Natural Capital Project. So it's a partnership among WWF and the Nature Conservancy and Stanford University and the University of Minnesota. So 2 universities and 2 NGOs that are trying to essentially do 3 things. Develop tools that map and value ecosystem services, kind of like the pollination stuff I was just telling you about, but broader. Test and apply them in these critical regions for biodiversity that WWF and TNC, that means the Nature Conservancy, sorry, TNC, really want to see conserved and think an ecosystems approach would help. And last, work to support policies that actually maintain or pay for those services, not necessarily a payment per se or a market mechanism, but at least policies that recognize ecosystem services and prioritize them within decisions. So those are the 3 goals that drive this crazy partnership of ours. And by multiple ecosystem services, I mainly mean this. So this is the list of sort of currently up and operational models for mapping the value of ecosystem services. So crop pollination, see above, right? So the Natural Capital Project model for crop pollination is the one I just presented to you. And I'm not going to present the others in nearly that much detail, but you can think about them in similar terms. A group of researchers have gotten together over 2 or 3 years to produce essentially a production function of how an ecosystem produces this benefit stream. So there was a team for carbon storage, and there's a model there. Non-timber forest products is actually modeled in a general way, even though they're very varied. Sediment retention, water purification, and managed timber production. So these are all models. Think about the pollination one I showed you. They all look about the same. And then we have a biodiversity model, which I've put in parentheses because it's not, in my mind, a ecosystem service, but it's a model as part of this package so that those trade-offs can be assessed. So I put this citation down here. It's a book that's coming out in March where we lay out essentially the math of all of these. It's the the foundational science of this approach we've all tried to take to quantifying and mapping and tracking changes in ecosystem services. Okay. So we've done all that, and we've written the book, but we also want to support people who may not have all the time and computer skills. And so we've packaged up all those tools and implemented them in a piece of software we call INVEST, which stands for Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. But the important part is it's essentially all those models written out in Python code, but put into sort of a point-and-clicky addition to the industry-leading GIS software. So GIS is computer mapping, essentially. ArcInfo and ArcMap are the sort of the big behemoth software company, and so ours is a toolbox within that. So If you install it, you get new buttons in your GIS software, and it prompts you for the data sets it needs, just like it did in the pollination case. And then you hit OK, and it produces a map of these ecosystem services. So you can get this software package now. It's open source and free on the web at this website at ecoinformatics.org, which is the NC's informatics site. And it's tied to this GIS software, which is good in that NGOs around the world use it, but it's bad in that it costs $10,000. So one thing we're doing, we have a grant now from the Moore Foundation to do, is to migrate that into this new Earth engine at Google, which is kind of, think of it as an analytical version of Google Earth. Google Earth lets you manipulate stuff. And so they've got a language written, and we have money now to try to get this free of ArcGIS and ArcMap. So that's the tool part. The apply it in various places part, this is, I think, a rough depiction of where natural capital projects are going on. And the goal in all of them is to test, invest with field partners and experts, make it better each time. Advance concrete policy goals, not just treat them as experiments, but actually be doing it for a reason. And then roll up and share these lessons, because we're all learning really fast what works and what doesn't. So all those circles are places that Nature Conservancy or WWF are working. They've convinced us that mapped information about ecosystem services would really help, and we've raised money with them to have this be part of their work there. They're all led locally. We're leading none of them, just providing our part. And the blue ones are marine. That's that code there. So I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to tell you about this one, the Eastern Arc Mountains, because it's the one that I've worked on personally the longest, and is kind of illustrates a lot of the things I've been talking about so far. So these mountains in Tanzania, this is the Dzungu Mountains. It's one of the Eastern Arc mountain blocks. They rise out of these sort of savanna woodland habitats that everyone equates with Tanzania, with these marvelous moist and cloud forests. Also surrounded by lots of people making their livelihoods, mostly out of agriculture on the slopes of these mountains. And that agriculture is moving steadily upward, such that the forests are increasingly restricted to the tops of these mountains. And that was a sort of motivating problem, is if we did a better job of articulating what the value of forest is on these mountaintops, and the value of nature generally in this region, could it provide a counter-argument to this agricultural expansion? Okay, so I just want to show you some of the results of INVEST models in this part of the world and how those programs are using them. And I'm going to skim over all the details of how we arrived at them. But I'd be happy to go back and talk with people later about that if just seeing magic results frustrates you. So here's Tanzania, Kenya, this is the Indian Ocean, Dar es Salaam in that red dot. The orange outline there is the study area, and it's the water basins that drain these mountains. The mountains themselves are in green. And green doesn't denote forest. There's a lot of mixed land use across this whole landscape, but those are the raised elevation mountain blocks that are full of these endemics, that sort of light shade of green. Right, so we take these various INVEST models and do a lot of interaction with stakeholders to get the data for them and come up with results like these. So this is water yield. This is essentially runoff from hydrological models, where there's excess water that runs off a pixel and is available for use downstream. Okay, so darker is more water. Essentially where water comes from is the intuition here. And we're using this one in collaboration with a water fund that's been set up by WWF and CARE in Dar es Salaam, that capital city on the right there. So we have two buyers of watershed services, a Coca-Cola bottling plant and the municipal water authority within Dar es Salaam. They've paid into a fund, but they don't have a lot of information on where they'd invest that money to best effect to conserve watershed services, to conserve riparian vegetation and other things that purify and regulate water supply. So this is a map that can help them do that, to target investments when they didn't really know how they would do that, based on rate of return, kind of an ROI element being brought into that project that started before we did. Another one is carbon storage. This is the one that's the subject of all these global markets. So again, darker is denser carbon. So these patches of cloud forest on the top of the mountains are those blotches of dark, but there's dark elsewhere as well. And it's clear, this one, right? So where would investment in forest conservation most pay off in terms of potential forest carbon payments and REDD payments. Tanzania is one of Norway's big REDD partners. $100 million has been pledged to Tanzania to develop REDD projects, or this is forest carbon conservation projects. They need to know where that carbon is, and this map is helping them do that. The Tanzanian delegation brought this map to the Copenhagen meeting. And the last one is less about payments and markets than it is about just livelihood issues. So charcoal harvest, this is a model, one of the non-timber forest product models that tries to take information about where the stocks of non-timber forest products are, but also where access is allowed and where people could get at it. So it takes into account not only the supply, but also the demand. And again, darker is where more charcoal is available and closer for harvest to more people. So where we'd expect the benefits of forests and other systems to have the highest values for local people. All right, so a couple things we're doing with this, again, really quickly, is one, evaluating these future scenarios. And I'm just going to talk about carbon and talk about just one part of the mountain chain, because that's what's published, but it's just those mountains in the upper part that's around in that box up there. And this is the chain of mountains today. Carbon storage baseline. Darker is denser carbon, right, for the year 2000. I guess that's no longer today. But 84 million tons of carbon stored in the various ecosystems of these mountains. And we actually worked for over a year with a whole bunch of different stakeholders to come up with two sort of development pathways for Tanzania. One, a hopeful pathway, Matazamio, and one kind of a business as usual, which they called Kama Kawaida. A whole bunch of things about demographic growth and access to forest carbon finance overseas and agricultural expansion and so forth. And so these scenarios are true for all of Tanzania, but just again, picking out these mountains, you can see the difference in carbon storage between those scenarios and the consequences, at least for carbon storage and potential for carbon finance for Tanzania under them. So under hopeful, carbon goes down 4%, worth at $15 a ton, about 50 million bucks. Business as usual, 10 times that, right? So down 40%, worth over 500 million. So you can see the kind of consequences of development pathways at stake for these stakeholder-derived scenarios. Okay, I'm going to go quickly here because time's running thin, but I just wanted to signal that there's lots of other things to think about in this setting, and we're doing that now this year. So it's not only the benefits from nature, but also opportunity costs of conservation. So what are the expected agricultural returns if you converted forest to the highest yielding or highest generating agriculture? We're mapping a lot of poverty indicators. This is a human development index to see whether policies that flow from ecosystem services are progressive or regressive in that sense. And also from an NGO's point of view, is effort around ecosystem services accordant with conserving biodiversity itself? So this year, 2011, is the final year of this 5-year grant. And it's going to be when we're doing all this synthesis and writing, trying to write up papers that make these trade-offs among services and between services and other things, and also a final push in Tanzania to convey our findings through WWF Tanzania and others to policymakers there. The last thing I'll just say on this, which surprised me and shouldn't have, is a software tool that allows input data and then shows you maps of value is a really good engagement tool with people. So this is a group around the non-timber forest product model in Tanzania. That's a watershed authority guy, a guy from Sokoine University, a grad student, somebody from the vice president's office, all kind of arguing about what this outcome means and whether they believe the data or no, that can't be right. And so this has yielded improvements in the model, but also them going back to their labs to get more data for their effort, and also just an awareness among government as we go along these past 4 years of what we're doing and what it's going to become. So aside from all the science and the research papers and stuff, this kind of tool, almost game thing, has become a really good engagement strategy. All right, so those are the 3 projects I wanted to tell you about. I would say, to be really glib, up here is where the headlines are. right? The total value of nature or our ecosystem services declining or not, and that's important. Down here is where some of the really rich-tailed field studies go on, which are satisfying from a scientist's point of view. But I think in the middle is where the policy relevance is greatest. Because as I keep saying, it's the scales at which and the complexity at which decisions are being made and the number of services at which decisions have to be made to account for these trade-offs. So I think that explains in part why I sort of gravitated toward that middle ground and find it really, really exciting from a research point of view, but also from a help the world point of view. Clearly, I'm not the only person doing that, and we aren't either. Like John said, there's 2 efforts at GUND that essentially occupy the same middle ground, and that's no accident, right? I think it's not hard to figure out what the policy relevance is, but I think that's going to be home to a lot of really fruitful and exciting research that's going to pay off in terms of policy relevance as well. Okay, I just want to conclude with 2 slides about where I want to go and what I think about the GUND Institute, if you'll allow that. So one is, I think the work that I just been telling you about is indicative of my interest generally, and that is interdisciplinary work between social and natural systems, problem-oriented work, sort of starting with what the problem, what the information benefit would be, and also trying to ask fundamental research questions alongside solving these problems. So I think in the future, I think a lot of things. One of the things I have to keep me sane as I work in my NGO job is a file of research projects that I want to do someday, and that file's growing, and the pace at which it's growing is part of my interest in this kind of job, frankly. I'd like to go do some of those instead of just write them down, but just 3 of them for now that extend from here. One is considering this full costs and benefits of resource decisions. This is what I've been talking about. What are the ecosystem services and costs of resource decisions? I think clearly I'll continue with natural capital project, and I think it would be really interesting to bring that here and merge it with the efforts that are going on here. I also think, and I've talked to several of you today about how links not only to economic values but also health outcomes and poverty issues is one of the really important things I think we should be doing in the next few years, and we have 2 big grant proposals out now waiting to try to connect changes in ecosystems to changes in health outcomes in a bunch of countries around the world. Equally applicable here in Vermont, right? So I was reading about John and your work with the White River Partnership. There's a lot of these same sorts of things where people are trying to decide how to use land and trying to estimate what the consequences of different choices are, no less or more here than Tanzania. And so I think it's got lots of applicability locally here as well. Pollination, I'd love to start up a field study again locally. And also connect pollination to issues of nutrition and poverty. So it turns out that pollinated crops supply enormous fractions of micronutrients to the diets of the developing world, such that you can actually quantify the consequences of pollinator loss into health outcomes. And that's with a guy at Harvard School of Public Health. That's what we're doing. But also, again, back to this local system. There are a lot of crops here in Vermont that require animals to pollinate them, apples and blueberries and raspberries and squashes. And it would be great to sort of understand how those systems are working and quantify the contribution of native pollinators there. Lastly, what's really interesting to me now is climate change impacts, both directly on ecosystem services and species, but also the indirect effects on biodiversity via our responses to climate change. So the way we change crops, move cropping systems, those are going to be even more important on biodiversity than the direct effects. Lastly, on GUND, I hope it's clear by now why I'm interested in this job. So a lot of the stuff I think about and like to think about go on here as well. And I have lots of thoughts about GUND as well, but I'll just show 3 here. One is, I think GUND is and can be a fantastic place where UVM harnesses the talent from all across itself to attack real-world problems. And that's just not in ecology or economics, but from the med school and the business school and all kinds of places. I think it'd be a really exciting center to integrate disciplines all over. It's already acting that way, and it's one of the things that would be great to strengthen. I would come from WWF, where I work there now, and we have offices in 100 countries that are all trying to get conservation done. Those are natural laboratories for students where social ecological systems are being studied and affected by our work. And so I think it would be a fantastic resource for UVM students to get connected much more directly with this huge set of laboratories where WWF's trying to manage natural resources. Also in Vermont, too, no less so than globally, I think UVM has this unique niche here. There's one that it can occupy by itself to test some of these ideas that are as equally relevant here as worldwide. As John said, I think GUND has a great chance to be the center of ecosystem services even more than it did or does already. So we've got this diversity of expertise already together. Me joining would just add another whole effort to that soup of efforts that can learn from each other and that have relative strengths and weaknesses. And I was just talking earlier today about the relative roles of these different modeling exercises, and I think that would be a really, really strong thing to develop. And lastly, this is kind of the most out there, but I think that conservation does a terrible job of rigorously evaluating whether its interventions work. And what conservation does is essentially try to manipulate social ecological systems for better outcomes for biodiversity. And we don't understand them very well, and we don't know whether what we've done works. It's like this terrible secret. And we don't do conservation by experiment, predict what we think the outcome will be, and then put in controls or at least matching methods in a post-hoc way to ask whether our interventions made a difference. And my science group at WWF has started that, begun investing really big in testing whether MPA, marine protected areas, work, whether people are better off, and whether fish are better off really, really than the counterfactual of having never done it. And it's shocking how few cases there are of a rigorous job of doing that. And we're going to do it as long as we can, but eventually it's going to have to be an independent group outside of an NGO. We can't be evaluating ourselves. So I think given how much this place knows about these linked social ecological systems, and given sort of how much I would know about the realm of this global work going on, we could be this place that tests these impacts. And I think conservation would learn a lot faster and spend money a lot better by doing so. So this is a lot of stuff, right? And the work I showed was a lot of stuff, and then I threw a whole bunch of stuff here at the end, but it really boils down to one big thing, and that is understanding how social ecological systems work, the benefits we get out of nature, the consequences of land use change on those benefits and on ourselves, and using that understanding to make interventions and policies and conservation much more effective. And lastly, trying to change the way ecosystems are regarded generally from these luxury goods that we'll conserve if we can afford it to things that are really essential to our lives and economies. So, thanks very much.